35,000. That is the number recorded in the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources operational log for a single aerial stocking run over the Uinta Mountains in 1956. I read that number when I first pulled the archival file, and I accepted it the way you accept most numbers in a government document, as administrative fact, as bureaucratic housekeeping, as the kind of detail that exists to confirm a program worked, and nothing more. The fish went in. The fish were caught, fishermen were happy, I didn't look any closer than that. Then I started looking at the lakes themselves. Not the stocking records, not the catch data, the lakes, what they were before the planes arrived, what was already living in them. And once I did, I couldn't stop, because the official story of Utah's aerial fish stocking program is not a story about wilderness made accessible. It is a story about wilderness that was already full, and what happened when we decided, very quietly, that the things living there didn't count. I want to be precise about what I'm not saying. The pilots were not reckless. The biologists were not malicious. The program produced exactly what it was designed to produce, and the fishermen who hiked into those granite basins for 70 years have had genuine, documented experiences of real beauty. Those lakes were not barren, they were not empty, something was living in them. To understand why the plains existed at all, you have to understand what came before them. In the years immediately following the Second World War, recreational fishing in the American West did not grow gradually. It exploded. Veterans returning from the Pacific and Europe were hunting accessible wilderness, and the state of Utah was, by every measure, unprepared for the volume of demand that descended on its mountain lakes. The solution they had been using for decades was the pack horse, mules and horses loaded with milk cans, each can sloshing with fingerlings, picking their way up switchback trails toward lakes that sometimes sat at 11 or 12,000 feet. I want to be careful here, because this was not a careless system. The records suggest that by 1950, hundreds of lakes in the Uintas were functionally unreachable by any ground-based method. They weren't remote because no one cared. They were remote because the terrain had simply defeated the logistics. The first question most people ask when they see the footage is the obvious one: how did the fish survive the fall? It is a reasonable question, and the answer, when you actually find it, is more precise than the popular explanation suggests. Survival rates in documented early runs were recorded at above 90%. 90%. From an open hatch at 100 feet. The program wasn't a gamble that happened to work. It was, by the time anyone was measuring it carefully, a remarkably efficient delivery system. The word barren appears in Utah Wildlife Agency documentation with a consistency that I find, the more I look at it, difficult to read as accidental. Barren, fishless, unproductive. These are the terms that appear in stocking justification records from the late 1940s onward, and I want to be fair about what those words were intended to convey. The absence of sport fish. That is what they meant. They were not biological assessments, they were recreational assessments. Pre-stocking survey data from the Uinta Basin, where such records exist at all, documents the presence of boreal toad populations, Columbia spotted frogs, tiger salamanders, and dense invertebrate communities specifically adapted to the cold, low-nutrient chemistry of high-altitude water. These were not marginal populations clinging to a hostile environment. The evidence suggests they were the environment. The entire food web of those lakes, the algae, the zooplankton, the invertebrates, the amphibians, had organized itself across thousands of years in the precise absence of a vertebrate predator. Hold that detail. Because what arrived in 1956 was not a fish entering an empty room. It was a predator entering a system that had never, in its entire existence, needed to defend itself against one. The displacement didn't happen invisibly. That is the part I keep returning to. The boreal toad populations in stocked Uinta lakes were not declining in some remote, unmeasured corner of the system. They were declining in basins that state biologists visited annually to assess stocking success. The field notes exist. The amphibian observations exist, scattered across decades of routine survey reports, noted and then not followed. Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, the U.S. Forest Service. The Bureau of Land Management. 3 separate agencies, operating under 3 separate chains of command, managing overlapping terrain. All 3 produced decades of stocking documentation. None of the 3 produced, in that same period, a formal assessment of what was happening to the amphibian communities below the surface they were seeding. Not one. No shared communication would have been necessary to produce that outcome. The mandate was the same. The silence organized itself. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series follows the evidence to wherever the official record stops. The zooplankton communities go first. Large-bodied Daphnia, the primary grazing organism in those cold, clear water columns, are selectively consumed within a few seasons of introduction. When the Daphnia go, the algal communities they were controlling begin to expand. The boreal toad doesn't disappear from a stocked lake in a season. It disappears across a generation, which is precisely the timescale that makes it invisible to an annual survey. Let me say that more slowly. The damage was paced exactly too slowly to trigger the review mechanisms that existed to catch it. That is not an accusation. It is a measurement. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't encountered elsewhere, consider sharing this investigation. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder the official silence becomes to maintain. Now, back to those lakes, because the response, when it finally came, raises questions that are in some ways harder than the silence itself. The response, when it came, was presented as progress. Beginning in the 1990s and expanding substantially through the 2000s, several Western states, Utah among them, began transitioning portions of their aerial stocking programs to triploid trout, sterile fish, engineered to carry 3 sets of chromosomes rather than 2, incapable of reproduction. The official framing was conservation forward. Sterile fish die out, they don't establish. The lakes, in time, can recover. I want to be fair about this, because the science is real and the intent, as stated, appears genuine. But consider what the shift to sterile fish quietly accomplished that a full public accounting never did. It allowed the program to continue. It allowed the mandate to survive. And it allowed the agencies involved to absorb the ecological criticism without ever formally answering the foundational question that criticism raised. What precisely was lost in the decades before the correction arrived? I've looked for that accounting. A document, a study, a formal review that attempts to quantify what the amphibian communities of the Uinta High Country looked like before 1956 and what remains of them now. I have not found one. What I have found are recovery projections, forward-looking assessments of what might return, given time and the cessation of fertile stocking. They are careful documents. They are, in their way, hopeful, but they are written in a grammar that has no tense for what was. The program didn't end. It was refined. The lakes are still being stocked. The planes still fly. And the baseline against which any recovery might be measured has never, in 70 years, been formally established. That is where this investigation has brought me, and I find I am not done. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. I think I am now. See you there.